Yeah, that should be right. So thank you, Owen, for this kind introduction of my academic life. I'm really grateful that all of you woke up this morning early to hear about part of my work during the last 5 years as part of the University of Zurich. And as Owen said, the title of my thesis will be Integration of Global Change Drivers and Biodiversity. I'm going to start with a wild guess that this morning you woke up, then you had some breakfast, a coffee, toast and marmalade, and then you brush your teeth, you put on some clothes, you started your computer, and here we are. And through these very simple actions that we did this morning, what we don't realize sometimes is that we're actually connected to many, many countries around the world. This is a map of the global goods trade. Each of these dots is $1 billion in trade, or in trade of different goods. So you can see how connected we are and how much impact we have through our simple actions. So not only we're connected through these actions to other people around the world, but we also had to require large inputs of energy and water, mostly to get the food and the items that we use this morning. So if you just think about your coffee, it can take, for making 1 cup of espresso, it can take up to 130 liters of water input in the land. And this is mostly in lands that are very rich, like in biodiversity ecosystems, like in Brazil and Colombia. So these actions that we have through agriculture, mining, and transport, they have an impact on ecosystems such as forests, grasslands, and wetlands. And in them, we cause things like land use degradation, pollution, and climate change. And associated with that is the loss of species richness, as we can see in all the dark areas in this map. These are what we call human-induced global change drivers. Global change, as in the title of my thesis. And we are the main drivers of these global change drivers, but the responsibles for these drivers, but we're also victims of it, given that our well-being is tightly connected to the well-functioning of ecosystems. So, for example, land use degradation is supposed to be the main source of migrations by the year 2050, because people cannot use the land and they need to move. So I guess by now you're kind of rethinking the cup of coffee that you had this morning, but that was not actually the point of this introduction. It was mostly for you to see that people and nature are tightly connected, and that in order to understand the system of how we impact nature and how our well-being is impacted at the same time, and how we impact other species and how the ecosystems function, we cannot, or we shouldn't, always study them in isolation, but together. That was the main foundation of my thesis. The general aim of my thesis was to study the interactions between people and nature using literature reviews and existing data in a conceptual and quantitative way. And in order to do so, I tried to address 3 specific questions. The first one is, what is the strength of the interactions between land use change, biodiversity, productivity, and people's nutrition? The second one, what do scientists know about how plant diversity and productivity change with fertilizers and light composition? And the third one was, how does the concept of biodiversity develop in people's minds? And today I'm going to focus on the first one, given that it's the most interdisciplinary of the questions that I addressed. The second one was mostly focused in ecology, and the third one in environmental education. And if you have any doubts or questions about those, you can of course ask me at the end as well. But I will focus more in the first one because there's a message that I want to share. So we're changing the land. How much and what for? In order to address these questions, what I did was first to define what were the variables of that were of interest to me. I looked into land use changes such as agriculture, forestry, and grazing. And then I asked, why are we actually changing the land for? What are our goals? And the most natural answer, and the first answer that comes to my mind, is to increase the productivity of the land. And in ecology, we can measure productivity as the rate of in which energy is transformed into biomass by plants, which are the primary producers. So that's the way that I define one of my response variables to land use change. And the other goal, of course, is not just to produce more, but to feed people. So my other interest variable was the nutritional status of people. So, for example, the level of vitamins, of certain vitamins or certain other nutrients that we have in a community. And as I said already, an unintended, usually unintended outcome of our activities is the modification of biodiversity. So the change in the number of species that there is in the places that we occupy. As I mentioned, I'm not interested in those isolated, but as part of a system. And so this is more or less the system that I studied. And each time you see an arrow in one of these schemes, it means that it's an effect. What is the method that I used? The method that I used was literature reviews and meta-analysis. I didn't have fieldwork, but I used all the fieldwork that RL people do. And so each of these reviews leading to a meta-analysis, it starts with a question that has an effect and a response. So for example, what is the effect of land use change on the diversity of species? Then, after having this question, what I did was to search for experimental studies that had worked on this topic. So, for example, in search engines like Web of Science, and this leads to a pile of studies. Not all of them are useful, fortunately. And so I could, what I did, the next step was to filter those that were of interest for me and to subset them, mostly based as well on the kind of reporting that they had. So if it was a quantitative reporting or not. When it was, then I could use it and I note down the findings of the studies, so the reported effects. So for example, a paper could have said that they found a 10% decline in biodiversity with a certain land use activity. Not every paper finds the same, not every study finds the same answer. So some papers could have found a negative effect, like we can see here, paper 1, and that's the way that I annotated, with an effect in the center and then the error to the sides. On other papers could have found a positive effect of an activity, in this case on the diversity of species, like the paper 2, the green one. And others could have found no effect. No effect would be 0. And so you will see this kind of plots from now onwards, and that's the way that I note down the effects. And then after making an average effect to see what's the average effect of one activity, what I did is try to explain the differences between the findings of papers. For example, by looking into issues such as where this paper was performed, where the study was performed. And so actually, I'm jumping into the results already because there's lots of them. And what I will do is, I did one of these reviews for each of these arrows in this scheme, and I will go through each of them and then make a summary at the end. I will start with the first interaction, land use activities on biodiversity. And what I have here are 2 data sets. The first data set was of a set of studies that reported changes in biodiversity when converting land from one type to another. So from a native patch of land to some activity, for example, forestry. And the second data set was a data set that reported of studies reporting changes in biodiversity at different intensities. So we had an activity already at a lower or intensity than the one that was used as a treatment in a way. And these data sets overall, they were from studies done in 32 countries, around 70% of those were in Europe though. And the ecosystems, I grouped them in order to have a more number of studies per ecosystem. I grouped them in forest, grassland, and shrubland. And then the taxa, I grouped them in fungi, plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates. How do I calculate the average effect? So the way that I calculated the average effect for each of these data sets is as a log response ratio, where I take this mean species richness that was found in the activity for the first data set, and I put it over the mean species richness that there was in the native control. And that gives me an idea of what was the actual effect of that, of change in the land. And in the second data set, we have higher intensity over low intensity for the log ratio. And for those of you that know about this, I did some corrections over this analysis for independency between citations and for low sample size when this was appropriate. So what was the average effect? What I found is that there was always a decline in biodiversity with land use changes. It was stronger in the data set of type. So when changing from native to an activity of around, the way you can read this result is there was around a 23.35% of decline in biodiversity, and the numbers between them is the confidence interval. Between brackets is the confidence interval. And for the second data set, I found that increasing or at higher intensities, you had 15%, around 15% of loss, 16% of loss of biodiversity. And there was a large variability within studies. A nice way of visualizing this variability between studies is by visualizing the significant explanatory variables. So I try to look for, what I said before, ways of explaining why not every paper finds the same answer, which could give different interesting conclusions. I can derive interesting conclusions from that. And so the way to read these plots, as before, is a bit more complex than the one we saw before, but it's more or less the same. In the x-axis, you have the biodiversity change. 0 would be no effect, and towards the left you have the negative effects, and towards the right the positive ones. And in the y-axis we have different activities that they were present in this data set. So for example, we see that animal pasture and cropping, they are the activities driving the most damaging changes on biodiversity. So for animal pasture, for example, we have around a 60% decline in biodiversity for the first data set, and followed by cropping. Something that was also interesting from here is that agroforestry, which is usually portrayed, usually not always, but portrayed as an activity that is a bit more sustainable than cropping, didn't really show significant differences from the ones cropping showed on the biodiversity change. As we can see, the errors overlap. So in my data set, at least, they are not significantly different. And another interesting thing is that forestry was the one causing the least biodiversity declines. In fact, the effect is positive, although the errors are crossing also the 0, so it wouldn't be in a way significant, but that's because we have a large variability within this data set as well. And now in the second graph, we can read sort of the same conclusions for the second data set, which is not always the case, but in this case, animal pasture was also the activity that led to the highest biodiversity losses when increasing or at higher intensities of land use change, followed by cropping. If we see the same data set explained by the ecosystem in which the studies were done, we see, now I show both graphs at the same time because I will compare them. We see that forests actually do have a decline in biodiversity, and yes, and actually all of the ecosystems here, except some of the studies from shrubland, are the ones that that suffered a biodiversity decline. But before saying that, grassland is the one that in the second data set had the highest impacts, which is interesting because grasslands are in a way seen as productive ecosystems, and sometimes biodiversity in them is not very much taken into account as potential ecosystems worth of conservation programs. When trying to explain the data set by the taxa that were involved in the studies, invertebrates in the first data set were the ones that suffered the highest impacts of loss in diversity, whereas in my data set, vertebrates didn't suffer as much. It's worth noting that in my data set, I didn't have big mammals or vertebrates in general. It was mostly birds and rodents. And there was indeed a paper that weighed a lot that was referring mostly to invasive species of birds. And in the second data set of intensity, we see that actually plants and vertebrates are the ones that suffered the highest declines in biodiversity, but all of the taxa, including fungi in most of the cases. I'm not going to do a summary there, but at the end of all the interactions that I will show. So now I will go to the second interaction. This would be, what are the effects of land use in primary productivity? And for these data sets, I also had two data sets that one reported changes in productivity when converting land, and the other changes in productivity at different intensities. And the thing that I expected would be that our activities increase productivity, because that's what we do them for, mostly. And these data sets were from studies in 18 countries, around 40% of them were in Europe, and I grouped them again, the ecosystems in forest, grassland, and shrubland. The effects in this case is again the mean productivity, the log ratio, calculated as a mean productivity in the activity over the native, or in the higher intensity over the low intensity, and I used the same corrections. What I found and was quite interesting is that overall productivity declined with land use changes, contrary to what I supposed that I was going to get. I have my hypothesis. Indeed, this decline was higher in the dataset intensity. This is around a 20% of decline of productivity, and in the type. So whenever we transform from native to another type of land, then it's almost zero. It's not as high. And this in a way is interesting because it could be, or we could interpret it in a way as like when we just change the land, we do it to increase its productivity from a native to an activity that we want to take profit from. But it could be, it could be that we manage that at the beginning, but then overall, in general, in the long term, when we intensify the use of the land, then actually productivity declines. Again, a way of visualizing these effects would be in the type of graphs where we write down the effects per type of activity, knowing that type of activity was a significant explanatory variable for this variability between studies. And we see that for the type data set, I actually only had cropping studies. And even within just cropping, there was a large variability. So there were many cases in which this was a positive change in terms of productivity, and many cases where it was low. And it's there mostly for comparison with the other data set, where actually animal pasture was the one that, again, seems to be showing the highest damages, also in terms of productivity of the land. If we see the ecosystems, we see that overall most of them are negative, but actually in the type data set, so when changing from native to an activity, grasslands seem not to have as much declines in productivity as forests, which is also very interesting in the current times where we are being told that forests are in yeah, are very important in terms of climate change remediation. In the other dataset for land use intensification, I found it interesting that shrubland was the one, even though there were no significant differences with the others, but shrubland, the trend is that shrubland would be the one that loses the most productivity. And I also find it interesting because it's not an ecosystem, it's an ecosystem that is a bit understudied. And it's not an ecosystem that is being paid much attention compared to, for example, forests. So we do see that there is a decline in productivity in these kind of ecosystems as well. So now we studied the first two interactions, land use change activities, what is their effect on biodiversity, and what is their effect in productivity. But in order to understand fully what we observe in the behavior of these systems, we should also take into account the effects of biodiversity in primary productivity. And this is an interaction that is quite well studied in the literature. In general, the consensus is that biodiversity, so having more number of species in the land or in a patch, increases the productivity of them. And this has been found in many control experiments in the lab, more than 500, as we can see in this abstract, but also it has been confirmed in the wild, so as an effect that it can be seen also in the wild, not only in control experiments. It is true that there remain some controversies regarding the shape of this relationship and the mechanisms behind them. And I think mostly nowadays studies are focusing on that rather than just saying whether it's positive or negative. But the general consensus is that there is a positive relation. And that's why I didn't work with a huge data set for this interaction. I still wanted to do an independent analysis in order for it to be comparable to the rest of the interactions that I was working with. But I worked with a bit of a smaller data set, mostly in Europe, where these studies had a control with a low number of plants species and a treatment, what we call treatment, with more species. And then they compared which one was more productive. And those are the values that I use for calculating the log ratio. What I observed indeed is that there was a large positive effect of biodiversity in productivity. So productivity increased with more than, in average, 57%. With higher biodiversity. So higher biodiversity, higher productivity, and again, I had some variability within studies. I tried to explain this variability by looking into the initial level of biodiversity. So whether it made a difference to have 2 species in the control or 5 species in the initial level, or 5 species or 10. And actually I found that that was not significant, and I think that's quite an interesting study for being a non-significant one. And I also looked into the presence of functional groups, whether I could explain the changes in productivity based on which functional groups we had within this species diversity. And I did find that the presence of legumes and forbs could explain part of this productivity, which has been seen before in some other individual papers. So now we see it like in a sort of synthesis. I will go now to the fourth interaction. We have already seen the ones in the top, and now this interaction actually tries to address if we actually achieve our goals of feeding people, of increasing the nutrition of people through our sometimes quite damaging land use interventions. Here I did an exhaustive search, not unlike in the other reviews where I achieved quite quickly a number of papers that could give me a data set that I could use without a publication bias. But here I did an exhaustive research of looking for studies that had reported on changes in nutritional status, so for example, vitamin levels, after land use interventions. And I found only 15 studies that actually reported a quantitative effect, and all of them were mostly referring to land interventions that increase species richness and productivity at the same time, and interventions that were targeted to increase nutritional levels. So I didn't find papers or studies that had reported on effects on nutrition from traditional land use changes that not necessarily were targeting that as part of an educational program. So most of the papers that I found were about gardens, in teaching people or including a garden in a place where it was not before, in poor or rural areas in Africa. And what I did over this, even if it was a small data set, just to see the trend, was to as well calculate an effect on doing the mean nutritional index reported, for example, level of vitamin A, reported after the intervention or before the intervention, over the one before the intervention. And here, actually, the correction for low sample size was quite an important thing. I did find that the trend was that the nutritional status after these type of land use interventions increased significantly, so more than 140%. Of course, I checked, and there is a publication bias in these results, so I would take them mostly as a trend. But even as a trend, I think is something significant to report on. About the publication bias, there's many reasons why a dataset can have a publication bias. One of them is that the search was not done in a way that you could pick up on the studies that actually report on this. I actually, in this case, after checking with experts, I think that it was not the case. I think the most likely reason is because they are not being reported in a way that is quantitative enough to do this kind of synthesis. And again, I wanted to see whether I could explain the variability between studies based on what was the type of land use intervention. And now here you can see what are the type of land use interventions that are being reported. So increase leaf vegetables in a garden, increase of legumes, add a new garden where it was not, or using compost, or increasing crop diversity, or similar nature practices, which is actually that try to imitate nature, but there's a lot of them that are being called in the same way, or increasing the size of the farm. And even though we have low numbers, all of them, they had positive effects on the nutritional status of the community. And I thought it was very interesting, for example, that something as simple as using compost in the gardens can have such a positive effect on the nutrients that are the nutrient intake of the population. So sometimes we think that we need to do huge efforts to tackle the global changes that we have. In one of them, in terms of social aspects, is hunger, but actually, and probably we do need to do instead long or large changes, but simple things can also help, at least at local scales. And the other interesting thing was that the more targeted and less broad activities, such as increasing leaf vegetables or legumes with target particular nutrients in the diet, they show less variability. So we can have more certainty regarding practices that are well designed, targeting certain issues. So I'm going to go to the highlights, and I know I'm quite fast, I think, but actually I'm happy if we have time for more interaction at the end. So I'm going to go to the highlights. Biodiversity and productivity decline with traditional land use changes. There was a difference between agroforestry and cropping, but it's a bit unclear. It was not significantly different one from the other. Animal pasture showed to be detrimental both for biodiversity and productivity in almost all my data sets. This could be quite controversial because in many places animal pasture, such as here in the Alps, sometimes they are being used, you use animals to open the space for species diversity, so within conservation programs. But I think the point to be made, I didn't have any of these studies in my data set. I just had studies of real, in a way, animal pasture projects. So maybe the point to be made there is that unless conservation is a target within the animal pasture project, it is highly likely that biodiversity will suffer from it. And I think that would be the trend to take out of my data set. Not necessarily that animal pasture can be never used as for conservation. Another point, another highlight is that grasslands and shrublands show a stark decline in biodiversity, and that productivity declines mostly when increasing intensity of activities and in forests. This is something that I also mentioned during the average, when I showed the averages. So productivity declines were mostly in intensity, when we intensify the activity, and not necessarily when we change the land, with a large variability. Interestingly, from the last interaction, there is a knowledge gap on nutritional effects on land use, at least in a quantitative way. And I put this also there because there were lots of studies. From those 700 or almost 800, only 15 I could use for quantitative way, but most of all the rest were actually very good studies describing different situations in land use interventions and how they were affecting different aspects, social aspects of the population. However, many of those syntheses, I found 2 syntheses, not many, but 2 syntheses that actually didn't try to make a quantitative analysis as well, and didn't and couldn't, because it was not enough quantitative studies to have a conclusion. And why is it important to have a quantitative measure besides all the conceptual and descriptive ones? Is because this really helps usually with management and also with prediction for new communities that you want to help. It also always helps to have some sort of value that you can rely on, rather than just describing what happens. And I did anyway observe a positive trend of nutrition targeted land use interventions. I think that's one of the points that I found the most interesting, because when you see the system as a whole instead of all the individual interactions, one could think, what would be our impact in the world and in the land, in terms of land, if all of our interactions, if all of our effects would be targeted to improve human well-being, community, local well-being, through actually increasing primary productivity and biodiversity at the same time. So one of the things that that is a bit unfortunate that I don't have more studies in this respect is that I couldn't determine whether it's productivity or biodiversity that increased the nutritional status in the trend. But overall, we know that both of them are increasing in this type of land use interventions. So yeah, so mostly I think that was although you cannot really derive very specific management practices, the idea that I got from this is mostly about rethinking, or that I want you to take from this, it's mostly about rethinking what for or who for do we change the land. And I have a bit of a broader take-home message from my thesis. It was, in a way, quite a risky thesis from the very first moment, in terms of selection of variables, which sometimes could be quite subjective, in terms of the interdisciplinarity that was required to understand these very different topics, and in terms of the level of expertise in one particular methodology, statistical methodology, that was required. And why am I choosing this chapter in particular and not the other 2 that are a bit closer to publication, if one could say that, after a couple of rejections? I chose this one because actually I think that's what we should do. We should take the risk to discuss the things that we prioritize, to train ourselves to understand each other, and to develop better integration methods in order to tackle the global changes that we have in common. And so with that, I want to thank firstly my supervisors, my committee meeting, Owen Pecci, Norman Backhouse, Brent Harschmidt, and Michael Shepman, and really especially Owen, who is a person that doesn't fear risk. He always takes, not always, but a lot of time takes a lot of risks, like he did with my PhD. And I also would like to help my collaborators, in this case for this chapter, Peter Battery with the analysis, and my mentor, Maria Joao Santos, and my funding, my hosts and my fundings, agencies, mostly University of Zurich, the University Research Priority Program, Global Change and Biodiversity, and the Swiss National Foundation. And in particular, with the URPP Global Change, it was really a pleasure to be part of this project. And it was really a blessing to be part of the Predictive Ecology Group and the URL Nature Trail, especially with Sarah and with Morana. And I also wanted to help to recognize all the administrative people that helped me throughout these years, in administration, IT, the science manager, Deborah, the dean's office, the FAUS, the management of the URL campus, and my family and friends. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Please continue sharing your screen so that if we need to look at any of the slides, we can still do so. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that presentation. Questions from the audience, please. Please write in chat, I have a question, or why not just unmute yourself and ask the question. All right, Molly.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ali. That was quite impressive. And I agree, you've taken a very challenging task here for your PhD. I was wondering if you could share some reflections with us, given that you've done so many different methods. I was struck by your comment at the end about wanting to have sort of quantitative data for the nutrition, but also your comments throughout about recognizing the very contextually different situations for the relationships you explore, right? That in the Alps, you actually have greater biodiversity in many cases with animal pastures than with forests, but in other cases you have different ones. So what do you see as the role of this kind of meta-analysis where that variation is often collapsed? How should that be used by policymakers? How should the kinds of conclusions generated by your thesis be used in practice? And how do you need to present them to assure that they're used in a way that's appropriate?
Yes, this is a very interesting question. I don't know if everyone followed, but I think I will just repeat it briefly just to see if I understood as well. What you ask is, why is it useful to do a global analysis at higher scales or broad scales when most of the times you have a very large variability within the effects that you observe? And this is a very contended thing within it. It's a trade-off between looking at different scales. This kind of analysis can be done at narrower scales. And actually in the second chapter, I kind of focus not in very general land use changes, but in fertilizers, in a way, nutrient inputs, and that made it a bit narrower. So there, the conclusions that you can make, they are less of trends and more of advice that you can give for ecosystem management. So that's kind of the trade-off. However, also the more you go into these narrow grain scales, then the more you also lose the perspective of how general these these conclusions are and how general these effects are. And I think that's the value of, I think, policymakers. There's different policymakers, but they are occupied with different scales as well. But in general, they should be able to communicate with other people elsewhere. And so one of these uses is that, to see the broader scale, to see how you connect with others, if this is a general pattern or not. And statistically, there's also ways to deal with heterogeneity of data. Did I answer the question, or you want to?
Maybe just one specific part that you could elaborate on. How would you imagine your results being applied on this sort of larger scale? What would be the implications? Can you think of, maybe you wrote some of these in your dissertation, what would be some specific policy implications of these sort of broader level conclusions from your data?
Well, the most tangible, I think, is regarding what I mentioned about nutrition and land use interventions that target nutrition actually achieving the nutritional goals that they want, whereas others, there's a knowledge gap. So the first thing is there's a knowledge gap. So one application would be to implement programs that actually quantify or that have a better description as well of the effects. But in second place, if this is confirmed that this is a good way of managing the well-being, of improving the well-being of people, then it would be a point in support of programs such as, they are called nutritional, I have a slide of it, but nutrition sensitive agriculture, which are programs that really target crop diversification and people's needs. Maybe in second place of the economic value of the land or other types of productivities. And so one thing, this is actually a policy framework to work on, to start at broad scales. Maybe sometimes it wouldn't work at local scales, but most of the times that's more or less what the outcome of the broad scale conclusions could be. To say, well, this works in general, so there's a trend that this would be positive for well-being and for nature. So this is in support of these kind of projects.
Okay, thank you.
Question from Katie.
Sorry. Hi, Ali. Thank you for that really, really good overview of what you did in that first monster chapter. My question, I had a lot of questions, but I'm just going to ask you this one for the moment. I was really interested in what you found about shrub. Do you, from what you looked at from the papers you had, do you kind of have a feeling that it's kind of not really seen as a discrete habitat or ecosystem on its own, and that's why it's not so well researched, because it's very transitional, and I think it's often very overlooked as a habitat in the small scale patches where I work. But I was interested to see if you felt that came out a bit when you were going through all of the publications and the work that had been done.
Yes. So the question is shrubland a valid ecosystem to work on, according to when talking about broad scales? And my answer is yes. You can see from the trends that is a land that is highly impacted. It's also a type of ecosystem that could be target of remediations as well. Maybe some of these shrublands used to be grasslands and they are in degradation. And so when they are actually abandoned in a way, we're even making worse we're even missing on the chance to remediate other historically other types of ecosystems. And one note that I do want to make about as well the definitions is one of the challenges of this integration was to define things. So what is shrubland? What is intensity? All of these things, they seem to be defined. There's lots of definitions going around. There's very few people that actually report which definition they took on. And so when you try to do the synthesis, this shrubland that we have there could be actually 3 types of ecosystems, according to the theoretical definitions of ecosystems. So in a way that should be said, maybe all of these shrublands, they are not typical or what you would say just shrublands. It's very important for people to define the ecosystems where they work on, and if they are in the limits of transitioning ecosystems and so. But overall, shrubland is a valid ecosystem to work on and is suffering about global change.
Thank you.
Other questions, please? We have a few more minutes where we can take some further questions. Katie has another, but is there somebody else who'd like to ask a question?
But we talk every week, Katie.
I know.
Katie, go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
I think Sophia might have a question actually.
Yes.
I'm happy to sit back.
Sophia, you go first and then we'll have Katie afterwards.
Okay, now I can't see Ali. Thank you so much for this talk. Really well done, very interesting. I just wanted to go back at something that you mentioned at the very beginning about where these studies originated. I think you mentioned it only briefly, that 70% of them are in Europe. I just wanted to ask you whether you could elaborate a bit on this, whether you think that, I mean, obviously it's a knowledge gap, but whether you think if your results might have been different if you had, let's say, more studies from the global south, or yeah.
Yes, it's more about. So these were the first ones. They were not exhaustive reviews, which means there were many more papers that I haven't looked at, and I didn't want to bias myself to target one or other region, which maybe I should have done, or I could do still, to actually have more representation from different regions. Overall, maybe it is a sign that most papers are from Europe. And this is kind of natural. This happens in lots of other ecology, but in lots of other disciplines as well, that there's more funding in the US, in Europe, maybe in Australia, and there's more research being done there also for political reasons. And whether I think that my answers or my conclusions would be modified, maybe some of them would, because we would get more tropical, for example, representation, tropical ecosystem representation. But overall, I think for land use effects, Europe is quite a nice place to work with because there's lots of it. So, in a way, I think these are still valid conclusions in that sense. But it would be nice to have more papers from other places.
Katie, do you want to come in with your question?
Thank you. Yeah, I had lots of questions around pasture and definitions, and you sort of talked about definitions already, but I'm assuming you didn't at any point look at below ground productivity as well, because obviously this is based on primary productivity. I suspect the number of papers on below ground are quite rare, but when we look at pasture and age of that habitat, it could actually have very high below ground productivity. Was that something, I appreciate you didn't look at it, but is it something that you came across in the papers that you were going through?
Yes, actually I collected information from above net primary productivity and below net primary productivity. There were less papers of below, and it was not significantly different, the conclusions, and so that's why I didn't report it now as a variable, but I did take it into account as an explanatory possible effect or random effect. But I did find some papers. They were less. It would be maybe interesting to look a bit more deep into that.
Yeah,
say
more.
that they
I
could
think
be
I find
harmed.
it interesting because often you, with questions around pasture, in some locations you come up against questions of tradition and heritage and older farming systems. So from a kind of management perspective, that becomes more complicated, I think, to reduce the use of pasture. But I didn't know if maybe the soils might help to strengthen some of that argument or not.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see, actually, kind of cultural heritage of practices.
We have 2 more questions, and then we'll draw this to a close. One's from Deborah and then Rainer. So Deborah first, please.
Okay, so I have more a question. Ali, in your experience, you had to exclude a lot of papers because the data wasn't useful. And I was wondering, from your experience, do you think it would be useful to write an opinion paper to scientists about ways they could change the way they report their data in papers to make it more useful for these kind of analysis? And do you think this would be effective? Do you think anyone would take any notice? So it's a bit of a, yeah.
I think this is always good to do, like to remind ourselves as scientists to provide data that is usable by other people. So this would be always like, I wouldn't write necessarily a long paper, but a communication we could think of. However, that being said, every single synthesis that I came across of any of these topics, but all of them, like maybe but one, they all say that we need to come up with better ways of reporting our data and more standardized ways of sharing data. So it is out there. It's not that we don't know it. If you go to any review, you will see things like you get 8,000 papers and you can use 100, things like this. So, and it's in a way it's logical because we all have different questions. So maybe your question was very specific and not all of them would be useful, but many of them, for example, many of them for me that I couldn't use, it was just because they didn't report in the errors. So the methods, the design, it was all consistent with the things that I would be interested in, but I couldn't use it because the errors were missing. And at the beginning of the PhD, I mostly waited for authors to send me their data and reanalyze it myself, or waited for them to reanalyze and send the summary data. And this took, I think the average was 3 emails, and some people wouldn't, from data that you did 10 years ago, they wouldn't have it or they couldn't get it. And other than that, the whole design or everything could have been useful for the paper. So it's not, yeah, we can write something, Deborah.
Yeah.
I have time.
Okay, thank you, Ali, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
And the last question from Rainer, please.
It's an honor for me to ask the last question. Thanks, Ali, for a nice presentation. I have a methodological question. You've mentioned that you had exhaustive reviews for certain topics and for others non-exhaustive reviews. How did you choose the papers to include in the non-exhaustive reviews? Did you do random choice, or do you have some criteria to avoid bias, for example?
The question of bias is actually interesting because in a way it's just a command that you use in R, in the script. So it actually could be that lots of the studies that I did, it says that I didn't have any bias because statistically I didn't have it, but it's not really looking into, it has no way of perceiving, of picking up on these kind of other biases of non-randomized selection of papers. What I did, it was to start reading for the non-exhaustive ones, to start reading papers, and I reshuffle them. So every now and then I would reshuffle the sheets that I had. So you get a sheet with a list of papers from the search engine, and I had them at the beginning by reference, by importance. The one that the Web of Science tells you. relevance, sorry, relevance is the question, which means how relevant it is, the topic of, or the words in the abstract and the topic with regards to your word search. And then over that, I reshuffled and I took, I would say random, but it was not a randomized thing that I would pick, that I would do a random command on an R and then pick numbers randomly. It could have been done, it could be improved the way I selected those papers. Overall, as I don't know if Peter is there, but my collaborator, he would say that you shouldn't do non-exhaustive reviews. You should, if you have 8,000 papers, you should read the 8,000 papers. But this, of course, was in a way exploratory because it was just by myself and I had the other chapters as well. I still think the trend is reliable because the publication bias doesn't seem to be there statistically. But it's a great question about the methodology. It is, as I said, we need to develop better integration methods. Not all of them. I cannot read 8,000 papers for each of the interactions by myself. And however, I should be able to take a conclusion about broad scale land use impact during 5 years.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Thank you for the questions. I will draw it to a close there. Before we congratulate Alejandra on her presentation once more, I'd just like to welcome and thank Peter Battery. I didn't see that you are here. I'm sorry that we have not got to meet yet, and I do look forward to doing so at some point in the future. Thank you very much, Peter. So, well done, Alejandra. A round of applause for Alejandra. As I said, we will now move to a different Zoom room. I should just mention, though, first that it is not only the committee that can come to this private session that follows, but it is any faculty member. I've sent a message to Mary, Maria and Wolf inviting them in. If there are any other faculty members here, please send me a message very quickly in the chat and I will return with the link for the private session. So I'll stay here for a few minutes after we all say goodbye. Thank you once again, Alejandra. And we hope to be back, well, we will be back into this room at, I don't know, about 11:15, I imagine, plus or minus. Can't be exact. So see you back then. Alejandra, Michael, Norman, Bernhard, let's join in the other room. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
For everyone else, I will keep this room open.